as the circulation manager of the Paul Sawyer Public Library, but today we are going to be making a Dutch caramel apple pie for your holiday festivities. This is going to be a multi-step process, so we're actually going to be making a pie crust. We'll be making our own caramel, but I will show you a little bit of a trick to not make caramel if that makes you nervous. You don't have to. We're going to be making the apple pie filling, and then we're going to be doing that crumb crust on top. The first step of this is making the pie crust itself. This is going to make 2 crusts. We only need 1, so it does do the job of 2 pies. So you can freeze it, or you already have the pie crust for your pumpkin pie as well. What I have in my bowl already is 2 sticks of butter plus 2 tablespoons. So that's 1 cup and 2 tablespoons of butter. I froze this for about 15 minutes, so it's a little bit more solid, and it's going to be less likely to melt when we work with it. I also chopped it up so that it blends a little bit more easily. To this, we are going to add all-purpose flour, we are also going to add 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of kosher salt, and we're going to blend that all together a little bit before we start to mix the butter in. There are a couple of different ways you can mix the butter in. I suggest anything that does not involve the heat of your hands. I use a pastry blender, but if you really just want this to be quick and simple, I suggest a food processor. It's a great option, especially if you don't like getting a lot of kind of buttery bits on your hands. So we are going to take our pastry blender and we are going to work this in. What you want the consistency to be at the end is almost like slightly chunky wet sand. This will take us several minutes, so I'm going to work through that process while we go. In tow, what I also have on my workbench, what I have in my freezer, I left it in my freezer, is 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar plus 3 tablespoons of water. I have them in my freezer so they are also nice and cold. I haven't put them in the freezer for very long. I actually just put them in the freezer about 2 minutes before we started this. They should just be ice water temperature as opposed to really frozen. If you do not make pie crust a lot and you're working with a pastry blender and your arm starts to get tired, it's okay. Switch hands. Much like baking bread, it's kind of a muscle that you have to develop over time. And your real goal is to get as small a pieces of butter into the flour as possible. In addition to that, I also have 2 Ziploc bags, and those are going to hold each of the pie crusts individually. I am making these the day before we baked the pie. So what I'm going to do is refrigerate one overnight, freeze the other. You can freeze it for up to a month, so if you don't want to bake with it immediately, just put a date on it, throw it in the freezer, and you'll know when it's good until. But you can refrigerate them for up to a week, freeze it for up to a month. So I figured this would be a great pie crust. I have not used this one before, but I've had coworkers recommend it, and I always like to try something new. And I liked it because it made 2 crusts, not 1, so I really felt like it was a great time saver. And when you're doing your holiday baking, if you can make 2 things at once, great. So this texture is getting pretty mealy, which is what you're looking for. The butter is nicely incorporated, but it's still really cold. You want cold butter. You do not want butter that melts into your flour. I'm going to work this just a little bit more. Trying to focus on some of those bigger chunks of butter. stir to see what it looks like. It's pretty even throughout. You're going to see, unless you're working in a food processor, it's not going to be a perfectly even consistency, but it's really going to be pretty close. And if you're wondering who recommended this pie crust, it's Cindy. She works in Reference. She is a phenomenal pastry and cake baker, so I trust her in the utmost. Alright, I like the consistency of this. It's overall really nice. I'm going to grab that apple cider vinegar and water mixture, and we're going to mix that in just a little at a time. Alright, just a little yellow from the apple cider vinegar and very, very cold. I'm going to stir in 1 tablespoon at a time, and we really just want it to barely come together so that it holds its shape as a dough, but it's not runny. It needs to stay together, but it does not need to be overly wet. And this is the part you should work with your hands if you're working with a pastry blender. If you're working with a food processor, you can kind of pulse it until it starts to come together into a loose, shaggy ball. And once it comes into a loose, shaggy ball, you might have to work it with your hands. All right. I'm gonna add another one. Half. And you may start to have to kind of squish it to see, is this coming together, is this not? And I'm starting to get small balls of dough, but not enough liquid that it's working all the way through. So I think I'm going to end up putting all of this in there, and you likely will. Push some of my mess out of the way, because I'm going to need my workspace here in just a moment. Put those lids back on too. Alright, and this is just coming together. It's really cold to the touch, not uncomfortably cold, but it's definitely cold to the touch. Going to work it a little bit. This particular recipe suggests you need it just a little bit to really get everything incorporated. So you will get a little bit of melting into the dough, and that's okay because it does need some of that liquid. But the real goal is to keep it as separated as possible. All right, and it's just about together. Once you add those 3 tablespoons of water and that 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar, if you really start to think, this isn't coming together enough, you need it a little bit. At that point, you should end up with a shaggy dough. So, what we have here is enough for 2 pie crusts, and I'm going to eyeball half. I'm going to put one back in the bowl and put one in my hand and kind of a little more on that side. Alright, these are about even. So what we want to do now is shape them into discs. Not circles, discs, because when we roll them out, we want them to be discs then too. And you want to get as smooth of an edge to them now as you can, because I found when making pie crust, if you have cracks in the edges to begin with, they just get bigger and bigger the more you work with it. So try to make it as smooth as possible, but try not to overwork it. And at this point, in we go. I'm going to do the same with the second, and we will be back in just a minute to make the caramel, so I'll see you then. Hello. All right, we are back, and our next step is going to be making the caramel. I'm making the caramel the same day as I make my pie crust so that when I actually put the caramel into the pie, it's not scorching hot and it doesn't start to burn when it bakes and it doesn't cook more quickly than the rest of the pie. So what I have in my saucepan right now is just 1 cup of granulated sugar. If you have some lumps in your sugar, try and crush those up as much as you can. We want a fairly consistent and even sugar. What I'm going to add to that is 1/3 of a cup of water. And at this point, I'm going to swirl that around so that all of the sugar has water in it. It's all wet. We're going to turn it on. And I usually go somewhere between medium and medium-low. And that's what we're going to talk about now. 1, you do not have to make your own caramel. 2, if it talks about cooking it under really high heat and that makes you nervous, you don't have to do that. You can cook your caramel slower. I would not say don't cook it as super, super low as you have to, or as you can, but you do not have to cook it really quickly under scorching high heat. You can cook it more slowly at a more comfortable temperature to you if you're a little nervous. I still do that. I don't like to cook caramel quickly. I feel like it can go from a delicate yellow to black in 2 minutes if I'm not watching carefully. So that's what we're going to do now, is I have this over low heat, and what you generally want to do is put it over the heat and watch it. Don't stir it. That will cause the crystals to kind of collect. Swirl it if you have to, but the biggest trick I found is actually taking a jar, putting some water in it, and using a pastry brush, and if you get crystals around the edges, using that pastry brush and washing them down. And that will push it back into the liquid mixture, the liquid sugar mixture. And what's going to happen with the sugar is it's first going to melt and will turn clear, and then it will slowly get darker and darker and darker, and that's the sugar caramelizing. And you want it about the amber color, so almost the color of apple cider. At that point, we are going to move on to the next step of making caramel. This is going to take several minutes to get to that point, so I am going to let it do its thing and we'll come back. But what I did want to talk about, it's already starting to boil. So it's already starting to melt the sugar and cook the sugar into caramel. But the next step I wanted to talk about is, if you are not comfortable making caramel, don't feel bad. That's totally okay. It's a really scary process, I think, for a lot of people. Don't feel bad. You can still make this pie. Buy chewy caramels at the store. Put them in a pot. I'd say about 2 dozen chewy little caramels. Put them in a pot. Add 2 tablespoons of heavy cream. Slowly heat it all up, and you will have caramel sauce, at least enough to put in this pie and a little extra to garnish the pie. So don't feel like you have to make caramel sauce if you're terrified, but at the same time, try making caramel sauce. The worst that'll happen is you'll burn it and it won't work out, and you'll learn from it for the next time. That's a lot of my baking is, I tried something, I may or may not have failed. I learned from it for the next time. I think the biggest thing you can do wrong with making caramel is, you can burn yourself, so be really careful about that. But otherwise, all we're going to do here is let this cook over a reasonable temperature that is comfortable for you, at a pace that is comfortable for you. Once it turns an amber color, we are going to add 3/4 of a cup of, we're going to trade off the heat first. Add 3/4 of a cup of heavy cream, 2 tablespoons of butter, and just a little bit of vanilla extract. Whisk, 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 and you are going to have a caramel sauce. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to finish that with you, but right now I am going to pay attention to it and let it cook and turn a nice amber color. See you in a bit. All right, we're back. My caramel, my cooked sugar is just starting to hit kind of a dark amber color. I'm going to bring it up to the camera so you can see it. It's still very bubbly, it's caramely, but we want to put the butter and the heavy cream in as quickly as we can so that it doesn't start to cool down and solidify. So we're going to do that. And I already have my 2 tablespoons of butter cut and ready to go in, and I have my heavy cream. It will probably kind of seize up on you when you drop these in, so be ready to start whisking as soon as you drop them in. So in we go. Here's some sizzling, and away we go with the whisking. It has seized up on me a little bit because I let it cool just a little bit so I can talk to you, but that's okay. it will start to kind of melt and re-soften, and it's fine. Since I talked to you all a little bit, it gave it time to cool just a little bit more. It's not a big deal. There are a lot of things that can go wrong with caramel, and sometimes it just takes a little longer for it to come together, and that's fine. What we are going to do now is, once this starts to melt and come together, is we are going to add vanilla extract to it as well. And this is just going to be probably kind of a heaping tablespoon of vanilla extract. I don't always measure mine. That's one thing I kind of just eyeball, so that's okay. So all we're going to do for a while is whisk this until the butter is melted and the heavy cream incorporates with the sugar. And this will give you caramel sauce. So we're not making like solid or hard caramel here. And we're starting to get there. It does take a little while, but I really kind of want to show you what the finished product will be. I will let you know, when making caramel, it's going to smell like it's burning right when it's kind of getting to the point that it's pretty much done. So if you think you burned it because it looks the right color but smells too dark or smells too done, it's probably not too done. The scent kind of lies to you more than the color does. And I've got some kind of crusties in mind because I let it cool a little bit. And this is definitely one of the things that can go wrong with caramel, is that it will, the sugar will separate from the fat, which is the cream in this case. I have saved it before by reheating it because the sugar will remelt. That's one thing you can do. You can also just remake the caramel. That's kind of one of many things that can go wrong, but we are getting there. I'm going to turn this back on over the stove over very low heat, just to kind of heat up the sugar a little bit again, but it's just about melted and just about there. I kind of have one moderate sized lump of sugar that has decided it doesn't quite want to incorporate. So we're going to give it a minute, and I'm going to show you what we are working with. Also, please note, this is hot, so it is going to be a much thinner consistency than what it will look like when it's cooled. I made caramel prior to this, and I will pull that out of the fridge. Speaking of which, you can keep this in the fridge for about a month or in the freezer for up to 3. So if you wanted the extras in your coffee or something like that, it'll work great. I don't always keep caramel around the house, but when I bake something with caramel, I usually make enough leftovers to throw some in my coffee for a while. Alright, I'm going to heat this up just a little bit more. Once you've added the milk to it, the sugar typically will not darken. So if you have not cooked your caramel enough, unfortunately, continuing to cook it with the cream in will not caramelize the sugars any further. All it will do is kind of help it to incorporate a little bit better. So, just trying to get it there. If you get little caramelized crusty bits that will not incorporate, you can heat it a little bit, and that will help to remelt the sugar, which is what I'm doing now. So those are kind of some of the things that can go wrong with caramel. There are some times when you just have to remake it. If it doesn't caramelize and get dark enough, sugar-wise, you'll have to remake it. But here we go. So I have a few little crusties left in this, but for the most part, what you have is a nice, I don't want to tip it too far because it's going to start to pour out. So let's see if I can move my camera. What we have is kind of a nice dark caramel sauce with a few little lumps that I'll continue to stir out. This is a pretty frequent problem for me because I turn the heat off, get distracted, and then add the heavy cream. So I do this a lot. I reheat it a lot to bring it back, and that's fine. So yeah, this will turn into a nice caramel sauce. We only need a ½ cup for the recipe, and it generally makes a little bit more than a cup. So you'll have some nice leftovers for on top of your pie or in your coffee. I'm going to let this homogenize just a little bit more and it'll be set. This is refrigerated caramel sauce I made before. It is nearly full, but also if I take the lid off and make a mess, because that's what I do, it does have a lot of give to it, but it is pretty solid and pretty creamy. So that is going to look very, very thin compared to what you think of when you think of caramel sauce, because it is all hot liquid. Since this is a cold liquid, it's going to be a lot thicker. So don't worry if you're like, oh my goodness, this is basically just liquid. It doesn't have any thickness to it all. That's fine. Once it cools down, it'll regain its thickness. This is more what you're going to see when you think of caramel. Refrigerate it, keep it in the fridge. It'll hang out and be really happy for quite a while. I keep mine in a mason jar. I'm probably going to transition all of this over to a larger mason jar once that cools. I usually let mine cool in the pan that I make it in, and then once it's cool, I put it in a jar and refrigerate it. That's what I would suggest. So, just to get you all kind of, not up to date, but kind of remind everyone where we are. We have one pie crust that we are going to bake with tomorrow in the fridge. The recipe made a second. It is in my freezer. I'm going to keep it there for up to a month. I'll probably make this pie again in the near future. It's a favorite around here. And I have my caramel sauce cooking so that it will be ready to go into the pie tomorrow. And it has just finished incorporating. And it's just a little bubbly. It's very hot. But it is a nice caramel color, a nice saucy texture, and we are set. So, many times, even if you mess up your caramel a little bit, it's salvageable. So there we go. But we have pie crust, we have caramel. You can refrigerate the pie crust for only 2 hours and bake with it the same day, but I like to refrigerate it overnight. So it's a minimum of 2 hours, but overnight is kind of the ideal. So tomorrow we are going to come back. We are going to make our pie filling, which is just tart apples and some seasoning and then a crumb topping, and we'll bake it. So I will see you back tomorrow to make our pie and incorporate everything and hopefully enjoy some delicious pie as well. See you then. Good morning, everyone. It's baking day on our Dutch caramel apple pie, and I have already started on my pie crust. I have with me my pie pan. I have put a little bit of non-stick cooking spray in it. I have plenty of flour and a little bit of a mesh sieve to help me disperse it. I also have a bench scraper. This will help me turn the pie crust as I work with it. I took my pie crust out of the fridge just about 20 minutes ago. 15 minutes ago, I tried to work with it a little bit and it was still just a little bit too hard to roll out. So I stopped, let it sit for 5 minutes, and now we're trying it again. And that's a really good point to make, is if you try to roll out your pie crust and it just starts to crumble on you, the butter's too hard. Stop, wait a few minutes, and give it another try. That's okay. A good way to know is if it's too hard to work with is it'll crumble a lot. It'll make a lot of cracks around the edges and they'll just seep all the way into the pie crust. You'll have a few around the edges, but if the whole pie crust cracks, give it a few minutes. Now, you do want to work with pie crust quickly so that it stays cold, but if it's too cold, it's not going to work with you. So, as a side note, I did take my caramel sauce out of the fridge. It's sitting off to the side in my kitchen. It's best to measure it, at least for me. I had the easiest time measuring it at room temperature, so it's just sitting off to the side. Now, we are going to start rolling out our pie crust, and what we want to do is go forward and back, quarter turn. Bench scraper will help with that. Forward and back, quarter turn. At the beginning, you should have a pretty easy time making those quarter turns and just using your hand. And I'm still having some cracks. That's okay. You can repair them. At first, you should have a pretty easy time making those quarter turns and turning it by hand. But as it starts to get bigger, it may get harder and harder. And so you'll use that bench scraper to really help it along. I tend to have a lot of cracks in my pie crust. I think that's just something I have, and that's okay. Those are repairable. You can patch your pie crust. A lot of people do. So, a great way to tell if your pie crust is large enough is if you flip your pie pan over and it's bigger all the way around. Your pie crust is bigger all the way around than your pie pan. You're ready to transfer it. I'm getting some cracks. I'm going to start squishing them together. That's okay. It's part of making pie. Back and forth, quarter turn. And I have well floured all of my work surface in my rolling pin. And by making a quarter turn each roll, you should pretty evenly be able to roll out your dough and generally continue to stick with a pretty good circle the whole time. So you're not ending up with like an octagon or an oval or something like that. You want to have an even dough shape. And make sure you're rolling all the way to the edges, because if you're not, you're getting dough that's thicker. I'm just trying to press some little gaps and things like that back together. But if we need to patch it at the end, that's okay. We will. It will roll out and we'll be okay. My pie crusts tend to look pretty shaggy, and they still bake up just fine. They still taste just fine. I think the big thing is making sure you're working with everything and everything stays really cold. Because what you want to do is you want the butter to melt in the oven and create space between the layers of flour. And so that's how it makes those flaky layers, ultimately. And this is the point where we're going to start to use the bench scraper, because it's going to get underneath everything and make it really easy for it to turn. And if you can see at home, I do have a lot of shaggy edges and some cracks in the middle. That's okay. We're going to patch those up as we go. That's just always an issue I've had with pie crust. I don't know. Maybe I need to practice more. And I think this is a great learning experience, because the more pie you make, the better pie crust you make. So, hey. And I am going to do one more pass, and I think I'm actually going to check and see if, yeah, I think we're there. I think it's just not very even, and so I actually like to fold my pie crust into quarters. A lot of people like to use the rolling pin. I don't like to do that. I feel this is just easier. So what I'm going to do is fold it into quarters, transfer it over. I'm going to scrape some of this extra flour out of the way. And we are going to shape our pie crust. If you have a ton of extra flour, you can remove it. I don't always, and that's okay. Now, I have a fairly shaggy pie crust here, and that's okay. What we're going to do is grab our kitchen shears, which mine are right back here. We are going to trim off the excess parts from the edges that overhang and use those to patch up the short bits. And I am also going to use this time to talk about our next step. The next step is actually making the apple pie making the apples for the pie filling. That'll take you a little while, because we are going to take 6 to 7 apples. You're choosing a type. I like to use Granny Smith. And you are going to peel them, core them, and then slice them into fairly thin slices, no more than ½ an inch thick. And you are going to mix those with some seasonings, which I'll tell you about after this, and then we're going to go from there. But ultimately, that is the next step, and that's going to take us a little bit, so I am going to do all of the peeling and chopping and such off of camera. But you can use any kind of apple you like. I like Granny Smith, etc., etc. So yeah, I had another thought, and it's losing me right now. So a little bit more off the edges. I will tell you, I made this pie last week and the crust did not turn out well. It was really, really crumbly, and I still made it because it was the only pie crust I had. And even though it did not look great and it was even more patched than this was, it tasted just fine. So even if your pie crust does not look super, don't feel bad. Still give it a try. I think the big thing is having all of those flaky layers to it, and that's what gives it such good flavor. And yeah, so there we go. I'm nearly done with my pie crust. Getting into shape. And you do want to press it into all of the corners, but you do not want to stretch it into the corners so that it gets a whole lot thinner. You want to try and let it keep its, you don't want to make it overly thin. You want to try and keep an even thickness throughout. So, let's see. I may have to stretch these bits just a little bit. Alright, we are nearly there. I have one part I need to patch. There are a lot of different ways you can trim your pie crust off and do I believe what is called the fluting for it. I think that I'm just going to go with a pretty simple fork method for this one. So let me get this last little bit evenly covered and we're going to be good to go. Okay, so I'm going to let you see my pie crust. I'm going to bring it up around. Lots of patching, that's okay. This will still bake up just fine. It's fairly even in its thickness. There's a few rough edges, but it's fairly even in thickness wise. There's one or two little bits that have tiny holes, and I will patch those up. But we are going to take a fork and we're going to go around the edges. And we're going to flute our pie. And all you're going to do is take the fork all the way around and kind of overlap the last fork indentation with the next one, and we're going to do this all the way around. Once we have done this, put the pie crust back in the fridge so it continues to stay cold and the butter does not melt into the flour. We want a nice cold pie crust. And I'm going to trim off that excess. So, put this back in the fridge. I am going to peel, core, and very thinly slice my apples, and I will be back with you. Alright, as I mentioned, I have peeled, cored, and sliced 7 apples, and they are fairly uniformly sliced. I feel like they look nicer when you actually cut into the pie. And so now we are going to add all of the spices to our filling. As a side note, I have turned on my oven. I set it to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So what we are going to do now is we are going to add our filling, add our spices to our filling, everything except the caramel sauce. And what we're going to do is let all of those ingredients marry and sit for about 10 minutes before we add the caramel sauce. So we're really in the home stretch here. So what we're going to do is we are going to add 2 teaspoons of lemon juice. 1/3 of a cup of granulated sugar, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, and it doesn't specify light or dark. I have dark on hand, so that's what I used. I believe you can use either since it's non-specific. One. 2. teaspoon of cinnamon, 3/4 of a teaspoon of nutmeg, and I'm just going to eyeball a little bit shy of a teaspoon, and we should be just fine. A teaspoon of cloves, and it does call for salt. I left it out the last time just because there was so much salt in the pie crust and things like that. I really didn't feel like it was necessary. You can put the salt in if you like. I don't. And 1/4 cup of flour, and this will help to thicken all of the juices and kind of keep it from being overly runny. And I'm just going to mix this together with my hands. And what you want to do is make sure really mostly everything is evenly mixed. But really the big thing is everything is evenly coated in flour. So that when it comes to baking time, it all kind of thickens nicely. And you're probably going to get some that kind of sinks to the bottom. That's okay. Just kind of try and incorporate it. And this will start to seep out some juices, especially because the lemon juice is going to do that. That's okay. That's what we want. We want to have a nice juicy pie, and that flour will cause that to thicken. That's the goal. But we want to let this sit for 10 minutes. The next thing we are going to do, though, is make our crumb crust. So what I am going to do is clean up my counter, come back, we'll make our crumb crust. That'll give us about our 10 minutes. And then we will put everything together and put our pie in the oven. So by then, our oven should be at the temperature and we'll be all set. So I'll see you in just a few minutes. All right, we're back, y'all. Home stretch. We are going to make our crumb crust topping. I forgot to let my butter soften. I pretty much do this every time I'm supposed to let my butter soften. I just microwaved it for 15 seconds, so it has just a little bit of give to it. So, helpful trick. Also, I looked up reasons your pie crust may crack. There are a couple of reasons. One, the pie crust may be too dry, in which case, when you are rolling it out, you can actually put a little water in your hands and kind of dimple it in and let it incorporate and sit for a moment. 2, it could still be too cold. We do keep our house fairly cold, so if that's the case for you too, you may want to let it sit at room temperature for closer to 30 minutes or even longer. So if it's just not rolling out and it feels too cold, let it sit for longer or add a little bit of water. So those are options. But we are going to make our crumb crust topping. That calls for 1 cup of flour, 1 stick of softened butter. There we go. 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar, and we are also going to be using an egg wash for this, which I will make in just a moment. An egg wash is just an egg that you take and you whisk up, and it helps to brown the crust. But I will add the caveat, it helps the crust brown, but it also makes the crust look darker than it is. So it does lie a little bit, but it gives it a really uniform color. And that is the last of my brown sugar. I have just enough. So we are going to use our pastry blender yet again. This is going to be a little bit rougher of a texture, especially because you're using brown sugar, so it's a little bit crunchier anyways, and you also want it to be crunchier. This isn't going to have any more liquid mixed into it. Get the butter off and let it mix in some more. Try not to let the butter melt in your hands because it's already softer than the butter from the pie crust was. I'm trying to get some flour in my hands and flour wash my hands. Oh, that didn't work. This is why I wear an apron when I bake. I get very messy. Alright, this is a fairly homogeneous but crumbly texture. You do want chunks of butter versus chunks of brown sugar. So it should be crumbly but large kind of crumbles. Alright, we've got that. So we have all of our parts. We have our apples, we have our caramel, which I'm going to incorporate in now. We have our crumb topping. I am going to grab an egg wash and my pie crust now. 1 egg, I put it in a glass, crack it, whisk it up a little bit. It does not need to be amazingly well whisked. You really just want to crack the yolk, get it going a little bit. Okay. I found from previous attempts at baking this pie and from other uses of an egg wash, it looks tidier when you put the egg wash on before you put in all your filling, because then you can get the egg wash just down into the pie crust a little bit, and so it's not right on the edges and looks really uneven. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an egg wash all along the top of the crust where you fluted it with your fork, and just down a little bit into where the filling would be. You may not use the whole egg. Do not feel compelled to use the whole egg. You want to use enough to coat the edges of the pie crust, and that's all, however much it takes. So let's do that. And you do want to try and get it into the gaps between where the fork went, so that it just kind of settles into there too. So you want to kind of go across and up and down so that it really gets into all of the grooves of the pie crust. And I do have a decent amount of egg yolk left over, so we'll just toss that in the sink and I will deal with that later. Now, I do need a 1/2 cup measuring cup. That is. To add my caramel sauce. And it should be room temperature now, so it's still going to be pretty thick, but it should dollop in fairly nicely. I've got to use this cake spoon to get it going. There we go. I'm going to grab a spoon really quick, stir this in, and we'll also need a spoon in order to put this into the mixture. So let's stir this in. And we're in the home stretch, guys. This is about to go into the oven. Alright, and once the caramel topping is generally well mixed in, we are going to go ahead and gently pour, this is a heavy bowl, our apple mixture into the pie crust. Try and evenly fill the pie crust. Last time I made it, I absolutely needed all of the apples. It looked a little, I think I dropped it on the floor. I think it looked a little overfull at first. That's okay. As they baked, it settled and softened, and it definitely actually needed all of the apples. But this time, I am not sure. So let's see. We're gonna need all these. So there we go. Scrape all of that caramel and those spices in there. There we go. And we're going to tidy up any messes I made and even out the uneven bits. And then the crumb topping, I really felt just most easily went over the top with my hand. And so what we're going to do is put it around the edges, put some on top. And then let's talk about how we bake this while I'm doing that. So this is going to bake for 45 minutes at 400 degrees. After about 15, maybe 20 minutes, check it to see how brown the crust is getting. If the crust is already pretty brown, cover it in tin foil, or if you have a silicone pie crust cover, cover it in that. I found mine really started to get good and brown around that 20-minute mark, and so I did cover it and just left it to bake for the remaining 25 minutes on its own. So, there we go. We have our crumb topping, and this is going to go again into the oven for 45 minutes total. But after 20, maybe 15 minutes, check it. So, away we go. I will see you back with the finished pie. All right, here we are. Our pie is freshly out of the oven. About 20 minutes in, I did put a silicone pie crust cover because it did start to get fairly dark, and it has gotten a little bit darker, but overall I'm really happy with that color. And the way you can tell this pie is done is in the last 5 minutes or so, it'll really start to bubble and boil, and you can hear it crackle inside from all of the moisture kind of thickening up and boiling, and that's what you want. Is you want a nice golden brown color. You want the crumb topping to start thickening up and browning as well, and the inside to start boiling, so you know everything is done. I can tell the apples are quite soft, so everything is done. So we are going to let this cool. It'll probably take a couple of hours, and it'll be ready for our holiday table. I hope you've enjoyed making this apple pie with me. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.